Okay, good evening. My name is Nikel Terry Ellis, and I will be your host for today's panel, The Truth About Police Misconduct and the Mass Incarceration of Black Men in America. A little bit about me. I am the national correspondent for USA Today based in Atlanta. I cover the Deep South with much of my work focusing on issues of racial equality. I'm originally from Saginaw, Michigan, and I have a degree in journalism from Michigan State University. Today's town hall is sponsored by A Life for a Life Urban Initiative, which is a grassroots organization founded in 2013 to help advocate for social injustice. The organization is currently overseen by the friends and family of wrongfully convicted juvenile lifer and Detroit native Robert Hines. Robert was charged with first-degree murder and possession of a felony firearm at the age of 17. Hines was convicted of both charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. With the help of supporters, after fighting with the Detroit Police Department and the Wayne County prosecutor for 4 years, Hines discovered evidence supporting his claims of actual innocence, including witness statements, DNA evidence, and usable fingerprints. A Life for a Life Urban Initiative made its mission to create awareness about Robert Hines' case and other individuals like him who have been wrongfully convicted and incarcerated. Today we'll discuss Mr. Robert Hines' case as well as Kevin Harrington's case and the issue of police misconduct and the mass incarceration of Black men in America. Before we get started, let's take a look at a video that highlights the importance of today's panel.
I think our criminal justice system is working as intended. It is only broken to the extent that our society is broken. If your intention is to, jail massive numbers of people, if you believe that prison is an effective means of dealing with the myriad social needs of the African American community, then it's pretty effective. In fact, there's a long history in this country of dealing with problems in the African American community through criminal justice system, criminalizing social problems in a way that we don't do in other communities. For instance, if you looked at the research, you would find that somewhere around 60 to 70% of the people in prisons and in jails are suffering some sort of mental health problem. Upwards of 50% go in there dealing with some sort of chemical dependency. Viewed from another lens, these are public health problems. One could look at the massive number of African American men who are out of work, and the intersection between that and prison. Well, one could look at where prisons are located. And, you would find that a lot of times prisons are located in rural regions, where all other industries effectively shut down. And you might think of that as actually an employment problem and not a criminal justice problem. The enduring view of African Americans in this country is as a race of people who are prone to criminality. I mean, literally, we have the notion of Black people as criminals written into our Constitution. We have a fugitive slave clause, which effectively makes all the things that are normal for any other American in that period illegal for Black people. To pursue your own freedom was illegal. Slavery, was enforced by the criminal justice system, the slave laws. It made, very, very ordinary things like learning to read effectively a criminal act. Frederick Douglass is an escaped slave. He's a criminal. He's stolen his body, as he says in one of his speeches. Harriet Tubman, is running a massive criminal conspiracy, stealing people. I know we all love Martin Luther King today, but in his time, by, the highest powers in the American justice system, Martin Luther King was viewed as a criminal, by J. Edgar Hoover. Arguably, perhaps by, the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration. I say that because they signed off on the bugging, of his home and, wherever he was. The lens of criminal justice is the way this country has traditionally regarded Black people. I don't know that anything is broken at all. The deeper question is, are we okay with something on the order of 4,000 African-American males per 100,000 being in jail? Are we okay with that? Are we okay with, there being a 1 in 3 chance for every, African-American male born in this generation of eventually doing some sort of time in prisons and in jails? Are we all right with that? And that goes to the deeper question of, are we all right with Black people in the position that they are in our society? Or do we have some sort of, long-term commitment to justice?
Great video. Now I'd like to first introduce our esteemed panelists that we have here. Imran Syed is a professor at the University of Michigan Law School and the assistant director of the Michigan Innocence Clinic. He teaches, litigates, and writes in the areas of criminal law and forensic science. Jacqueline Williams is the program associate at the AFSC Michigan Criminal Justice Program, where she provides direct advocacy to people in prison with a focus on the hardest cases of long-term solitary confinement, juvenile sentenced to life without parole, and gender non-conforming people. Attorney Janae Lamar is a Saginaw native who manages her own law practice, the Lamar Law Firm, PLLC. Attorney Lamar focuses her practice on criminal defense, bankruptcy, family law, and general civil litigation. She's also the attorney for Mr. Robert Hines. Jimmy E. Green is the president and CEO of the Association of Builders and Contractors and the Greater Michigan Construction Academy companies that advocates, educates, and trains for over 300 builders in 36 counties. Lisa Coney is an executive committee member for the Saginaw NAACP. She's been employed with the Saginaw Intermediate School District for 2 years, serving as the school social worker and transit coordinator at the Saginaw County Juvenile Detention Center School. Kevin Harrington is a 37-year-old Detroit native who was wrongfully convicted of murder in 2002 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He spent 17 years, 6 months, and 2 days behind bars before his release on Tuesday, April 21st of this year from the Macomb County Correctional Facility in Lenox, Michigan. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to get started with some general questions about racism and police brutality and mass incarceration. So we all know that protests have erupted across the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd. Floyd was a 46-year-old unarmed Black man who died while in police custody when a white cop kneeled on his neck for nearly 9 minutes. But police brutality against Black men is sadly not a new issue. The police killings of Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Eric Gardner, and many others have risen to the national stage within the last decade. A study by the University of Michigan, Rutgers University, and Washington University found that 100 in 100,000 Black males will be killed by police during their lives. In contrast, 39 in 100,000 white males would die at the hands of police. The study found that police use of force is the 6th leading cause of death for young Black men. Where does the animosity between police and the Black community stem from historically? And I'll let anyone answer that one.
I think, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that you have to go back to when Black people were freed from slavery to what's called the Black Codes. There were laws basically implemented to control Black bodies, their movement, their freedom, and so on and so forth. There were also vagrancy laws put in place because once people were free, they didn't have anywhere to necessarily live. And then follows that indentured servitude where Black people were going back to plantations essentially to work, to have somewhere to live, to have food, shelter, and so on and so forth.
Anyone else want to chime in on that question?
I will for a little bit here. I think, and I'll fast forward it to today's environment, and I certainly think a lot of that is exposure, the lack of, there was a point in time, especially in urban cities, where we didn't have nearly the animosity between police officers and the people they vowed to protect and serve, but they were of that community. Over the last couple decades or so, we've seen a massive disconnect between people who are paid to serve a community that they don't even live in. And when you don't live in a community, it's impossible to know that community. And unfortunately, so much of that is a Black and white issue. As the suburbs have grown and white populations have moved out of the inner cities, you're asking people who don't know a people to come in and interact with the people purely with a pair of handcuffs and a gun on their hip. I think we're starting to see a lot of that. And when you look at the disconnect between zip codes, I always call it a zip code issue. I don't think it's a surprise that so much of what black people know in the inner cities about white people who live in the suburbs, or white suburban cops who don't know anything other than what they read or hear or arrest in inner cities. I'm surprised, quite frankly, that we don't have more of this. And that's certainly not to vacate that we shouldn't have any of it. But I think if we don't figure out a way to narrow that gap, that disparity between people who police somebody and the people who are being policed, I don't know how we get better.
And I'd also like to chime in on that, and I totally agree with what the two former panelists said. But we have to think about also is about building relationships. And when a people have been seen or projected to be have criminal behavior, bad behavior in the community and society, and you have people that come in and they think that this is an actual fact, that they are going to probably treat those people that they should be serving and protecting in a way that's quite disheartening. And so that's what we, it's the institutional racism that we've been talking about before. When you see a people and you don't understand their culture, you don't try to develop relationships, you have those issues and you have those concerns time and time and time again.
Anyone else?
I think just to put some historical context on it, absolutely agree. Relationships and community so important. And just to sort of expand on what Attorney Lamar was saying, there's really modern day policing is a convergence of two forms of control, really. So what we know as our modern day police force was one imported from Europe as their labor suppressors, essentially when there was unions forming and there was labor movements forming around workers' rights. There was a really suppressive movement among their police force that later became the Bobbies, or the police force in England. So we sort of imported that model, and then we took the South's model of exactly what Attorney Lamar was talking about: slave catching, criminalizing very normal behaviors, even socializing after slaves were freed. So there's these two convergence basically, which are rooted in capitalism and racism, essentially. And so then when you fast forward to modern day, you have an economy that largely cuts a lot of people out of that economy, as well as the historical context of racism from which the police force grew in the first place. You have a recipe for disaster. Adding to it, the fact that there are not community policemen anymore, and the fact that we are not making relationships or building bridges right now. This is, it's a disaster, and we're witnessing the outcomes of that.
So one of the reasons why the George Floyd case got so much attention was because bystanders who witnessed it recorded it on cell phone videos and posted it to social media. Can someone speak to how important is it to have this evidence, this video evidence for cases like this now?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I think it's paramount with the times that's going on now, especially my journey, where I was a guy that was only convicted and served almost 18 years for something I didn't do, with the evidence, and the world can see, because police officers and different people that works in the criminal justice system, they'll say, no, this didn't happen, or no, this is not true, and yes, we have the right guy. But when you can show evidence that's unrefutable for the whole community to see and the whole world to see, they'll know that, okay, they're trying to pull one over on us, they're trying to do something slick. So with the cell phone video and different things that's unrefutable evidence, I think the world needs to continue to record anytime anyone is pulled over or anytime it's an incident, because that's taxpayers' money. I think we should be all involved.
I could also add to that. I think the importance here is when you document something, then it's much easier to fight the denial that exists on it. In the idea of people being wrongfully convicted, that's happened throughout history, but it wasn't until DNA became available where people could really prove their innocence in a way that neutral people couldn't be in denial about it anymore. And once that happened, even cases without DNA, people are more accepting of the idea that maybe someone was wrongfully convicted. So I think, documenting and having proof of police brutality and, use of force of just absolutely unbelievable violations that like what we've seen in the George Floyd case, I think that really is opening eyes for people who haven't had the kind of misfortune of having to think about these issues for their whole lives. It's, just average people who've never had a bad police encounter now realize what, the rest of America has been dealing with. And it's hard to be in denial about it. So my hope is what comes out of that is not only, rogue cops who are caught on camera get prosecuted, but beyond that, I hope that, juries and the community is more accepting of this idea that police do act out of line from time to time, and they target certain races and certain individuals, and just kind of be more open to that when someone has come into court and testifying that they were brutalized during an interrogation, or that they were threatened with violence toward them or their family, and that's why they implicated the wrong person. I hope that the community will be more accepting of that now that we have proof that these things happen.
I love that, and Imran and you and Janae in particular. For me, I get so tired of these panels because they always reflect a reactive position. I think, when you look at cameras, it's a shame to me that Kevin is even on this panel because, again, it's another reactive thing. And that for us always seems to be a huge problem. And, that anger festers because I'd love to be in a position where we're so proactive, it minimizes the need for these kind of panels. I think the camera issue in particular is a check and balance. We certainly need it. If I'm a law enforcement person, I'm doing my job correctly, if I'm doing my job properly, if I'm really serving and protecting, I'd want that cover as well too. So, I shudder to think about the number of times cameras didn't catch something, but we can wax philosophically about that until we're blue in the face. In the meantime, I would encourage every municipality, every county, township, whatever that is, to ensure that there is a checks and balances, not for those people who are hired to protect and serve, but the people that are supposed to be protected and served. And then maybe we can prevent some of these Kevin Harrington situations, and you guys can focus on your other practices.
A lot of activists and local officials across the country have made recent calls to defund police and reinvest that money into marginalized Black and Brown communities. Is this the solution to police brutality?
I could get in trouble for this one. I hate that word defund. I do. I think redirect is a much better phrase for me, and that's just a very personal opinion. And I'm careful about that because as Black people, look, I want to be policed. I don't want to live in a lawless community. I certainly want to be protected and served. And quite frankly, some people deserve to be in prison, whether they're white, Black, brown, or red. I don't want that. I think there's a better way for us to redirect our money so that, we're not having law enforcement do things beyond the scope of their competencies and their abilities. I would love to see that. I think some of that is a knee-jerk reaction, and I get the anger, the frustration that comes out of there, but I think it's that be careful what you ask where you may get it premise, and that worries me a little bit. Now, if in fact we get to a position where there's more funding than warranted for a police department, I would be all supportive of that, but not without first having the discussion, where are those funds going? What are they intended to do? What are the expectations? What are the accountabilities? And then you start talking about the other pieces of that. So I just don't like that word defund because I think it takes out the real heavy lifting. And I think that's the lazy approach. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way at all.
Anyone else?
I would respectfully be on completely the opposite side of the pendulum. I don't think it's a knee-jerk reaction. I think that this has been rooted in lots and lots and lots, years and years and years of research, mostly by Black women abolitionists, honestly, who have talked for a long time about how when we are, if you look at the Detroit police budget, really just look at the line items next to each other, the police budget versus every other community organization, every other community service, everything else in the entire city. it's this bar right here is the police and every other bar is about this big. And, that's talking about mental health. That's talking about substance abuse. That's talking about community organizing. It's talking about safe spaces for youth. It's talking about education. It's talking about every single other thing that we know are mitigators for crime, right? Like as much as anybody on any side would want to convince you because of, sort of American individualism, moral failing is not the main driver behind crime. The main driver behind crime is poverty. And we have so many people who are so deeply rooted in poverty that just don't have any other, opportunities that even violent crime, the main driver of violent crime is poverty. And that's because you have these black market economies because people are largely cut out of our standard economies. So, I do think defunding, I do think redirecting as well, but I think that as long as we are, really militarizing our police with drug enforcement agencies and SWAT teams and all of these tanks and all of this thing that we have, while at the same time, teachers are buying their own chalk and we don't have, a safe space for anybody in the neighborhood to be, that we're just going to be playing sort of whack-a-mole with the, with the crimes that pop up. I think we need to get all the way into the guts of the machine, pull it out and rewire it. I don't think it's, I don't think it can be a top level approach. I think it needs to go all the way down to the roots. And to be honest, like I described earlier, the roots are pretty poisoned down there. So I think that we really need to find a way to dig up the whole thing.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I agree in some respects with both of the panelists. Coming from the city in which I come from and also being wrongly convicted from, we don't even have a high school. So when we talk about redirecting funds, we should possibly have the best police force on the land, and that's not the case. So I believe it's a situation where we need the community to come together. We need communication. If I'm a law enforcement officer and I stay in that community, I want that community to be the best it can possibly be, whether I'm getting a big paycheck or whether I'm getting a paycheck well enough to sustain my family. I love this community because I stay here. So I think that's what needs to happen.
I just wanted to redirect and really answer Jacqueline's, but I know it's funny. I think it's so much semantics because a lot of what you said, I actually agree with. I think it's just when you start with defund and I start with redirect, and yet the guts of what you just said, I absolutely agree with from an audit trail. So we wouldn't be too far off finding a middle ground. I can tell you that right now, especially the militarization of police forces. That's absolutely unnecessary. That'd be the first place you and I would start on finding a consensus.
Glad we're both here then. So we can both swing and come back to the middle.
Yeah, I was just going to say that our society as a whole is more punitive than restorative. And I think that redirecting some of those funds into organizations that not only provide professional development for police officers, like with mental health services, bridging gaps in communities, the funds could better be suited in that aspect, so to speak, but not to totally defund, redirect, and make sure that they are being accountable.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question. So according to the National Registry of Exoneration, Black Americans are only 13% of the US population, yet they constitute 47% of the 1,900 exonerations listed on its site. Why are Black people being wrongfully convicted at such a high and disproportionate rate in America?
I can speak from that from personal knowledge. Like I said, I was served 17 years, 6 months, 2 days, 35 minutes. I haven't even been home 90 days. I think it's an easy target. The Black community is an easy target because when we cry out and say, hey, you got the wrong guy, they say, yeah, whatever, who's going to come and help? It has to be some type of gatekeeping that's being done, that's taking place in Wayne County when they established a conviction integrity unit headed by Valerie Newman. With great groups like the University of Michigan Innocence Clinic. They represented me for many years. This type of stuff happens in these communities because we don't really have a voice. We don't have a voice at all. So I come snatch someone off their home and say, you committed murder. and you'll be in prison for the rest of your life until someone steps in. Everybody should be frightened when something like this is going on in the community. And I think that's the greatest and most impactful thing that we can do is have forums such as this, so everybody can be aware of what's going on, because this is happening right now, right here today.
That's funny you could say that, because I feel so strongly about that. For me, I'm no socialist by any stretch of the imagination, but I tell you two things that grate me more than anything, and that's the fact that in this country, the best legal services and the best health care is predicated on how much you can afford. And I certainly, there is no question in my mind that anybody of many means could get the best defense, black or white, in this country. And the fact that you fall into inner cities in particular, where the means for both healthcare and legal services are bare bones, I think sometimes you reap what you sow, and that's an unfortunate thing for folks who need it most. And that's the irony. If there's anybody who needs to be protected, who needs better healthcare, who needs more legal services because of the environments that we come out of. And I was born and raised in Flint projects. It's the people who can afford it. But that's not the case in this country. And we could probably spend the next 8 hours trying to figure out a way around that. But, you talk about justice in this country, it really is an economic piece. And we just happen to fall way down on both the economic chain. And so it's not a coincidence that some of these things happen, especially when you start talking about, that goes back to my original point that here we are, reactive again. So you're exonerated, Kevin. And so much of that is predicated on the fact that you couldn't afford to be acquitted. And that's, so exoneration is a wealth thing to me. People who have means get acquitted. People who don't get exonerated.
Absolutely.
I agree with Mr. Green. There's certainly a rich person, poor person impact behind these wrongful convictions. In addition to that, you've also got court-appointed counsel and public defenders who aren't necessarily paid top dollar like your top criminal defense attorneys. And they have a high volume of cases. And so their efficacy is diminished by the fact that they don't have the resources, they don't have the support. You're going into court defending maybe 20 cases a week, when you've got, the top paying attorney who has maybe 2 to 3 cases that week. And so in addition to the fact that color plays a role too, you got to think about a black man or a black woman or another person of color who's fighting for their life in court, and you've got a jury that's biased too. And, there are procedural, I guess they call them safeguards in place, do with that what you will, where you pick the jury and you try to make it as unbiased as possible. But at the end of the day, color of the skin plays a huge part in jury's decisions to convict.
Yeah.
I was going to comment based on what Kevin was describing earlier. I think his case is actually a great example of the question being, why are Black people so disproportionately represented among exonerees? Is because they are so disproportionately targeted for prosecution. And I think that's where we get to this. I mean, all communities have people that commit crimes. There's no doubt about that. But how a person is treated when they are suspected of a crime, that's where I think Kevin's case is very, very demonstrative. Kevin's case involves a young Black woman who finds a body near her house and calls the police. Now, I know for a fact that if somebody was to do that in my community, they would not get arrested and kind of threatened and beat until they point the finger at somebody, even though they had never seen the crime. But in that community, the way the police interacted with the community was basically, if you lived in the neighborhood, then you were a suspect. And Kevin's only tie to this was that, he had a name that was known in this neighborhood. And so I think a lot of this goes back to how police view certain communities. I think the same police will behave differently in different communities, knowing that that community is going to be less tolerant of certain behavior. And I have a case out of Saginaw that actually is very demonstrative of that too, where you just see how the judge and the prosecutor were treating different witnesses as they came to court. My defendant's family members, being Black people, are given this unbelievable amount of suspicion about, you must be lying and I need to see proof and data. Whereas, other people that are very equally situated, given their racial, identification are treated differently. And in that case, it was so different that, the conviction was actually overturned. But I think a lot of it just comes back to what the community expects of their police and what that empowers police to do when they're dealing with Black people versus other people.
Thank you. I kind of want to shift gears here and talk about the current conditions in the prison systems in Michigan. In the wake of coronavirus, COVID-19 in the Michigan Department of Corrections prison has been trending now with 68 prisoners reported dead. In April 2020, a class action lawsuit was filed against the state prison system, accusing them of violating prisoners' Eighth Amendment right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment by exposing them to the risk of COVID-19. Should more be done to protect prisoners in the wake of COVID-19 in the pandemic?
So I speak with prisoners every single day. This is the work that I do. And when we understood how this virus was transmitted, every person who does this job was terrified. If the virus could choose an ideal breeding ground, it would be a prisoner jail. And as a matter of fact, as of this morning, 10 out of 10 of the top COVID clusters in the entire United States are in prisons and jails. It's no longer nursing homes or anything like that. 100% are prisons and jails. And, there were some things done. The Department of Corrections will say, we tested everyone. We manufactured masks. We tried to move people around, but really what we're looking at here is dual crises. Well, actually, it's a tri-level crisis, right? It's the racial crisis that we're looking at, it's the pandemic, and it's mass incarceration. We get really, really used to these numbers, but when you contextualize them, there are more people serving life than people who were in prison in the 1970s. I mean, these numbers are enormous. There's 37,500 people right now inside the Department of Corrections, roughly. And we just don't have the capability to stop the spread of a virus when a third of our population is living in pole barns of 160 men. We have facilities that were built in 1877. None of our facilities, almost, except for a couple of them, are temperature controlled. But part of the other problem is that Michigan is in a crisis of austerity and has been for many, many years. We sentence people to 40% longer on average. We have the second highest number of juveniles sentenced to life without parole in the entire country. Wayne County has the most of any county in the country. We are most likely to hold people literally until they die. And one of the reasons we had such a high death rate is that we have actual geriatric units in our prisons. Most of the time, compassionate release, commutations, not sentencing people to life without parole will save people from getting old, elderly, aging way out of crime and dying in prison. Michigan, it's not like that. Unless we have a governor who's very brave about signing commutations, people are just stuck there until they die. And we know that elderly people are the most at risk of dying of COVID-19. So, all of the advocates who are working on this immediately said we have to decarcerate, we have to get people out, move people out. But our release valves are so small in Michigan. We cannot grant early parole because we have truth in sentencing. We have super long minimum sentences, and we sentence so many people to life without parole. So, as much as we want to do about the virus, what we need to do is let people go, and especially our long-serving elderly people who committed crimes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Jacqueline, I have a question for you since this is your day job.
Yes.
I mean, is there an active initiative because so much of this, as everybody knows, is based on density, no question, density and spacing. So is there something that's happening? I get the early release and truth and sentencing piece, but non-violent criminals, for example, are there any ways to expedite them out of the prison system to create more spacing?
Absolutely not, unfortunately. Just because we're running up against truth in sentencing, the DOC has said over and over again, we're expediting parole, we're expediting parole. But there have been a lot of roadblocks to that, and by expediting, they mean they're letting out like 100 more people a month, 200 more people a month, which in a population of almost 38,000 is not really making a dent because we had these 100% truth in sentencing laws. And there have been these like very few things that we can do, like try to waive the 28-day waiting period when there's no victim on the case. But I'll be honest, Prosecutor Kim Worthy denied all of those releases and didn't let anyone out early in the middle of a global pandemic. So we have, you know, roadblocks sort of at every turn. Not to throw anyone personally under the bus, but the prosecutor's office, especially in Wayne County, has a very, very long reach. And, you know, has opposed a lot of releases. But we as advocates think that the most important thing to do is to try to get elderly people out, and that would require action from the governor. So, you know, there's a large push, and I'd be happy to link some things and send a follow-up email with petitions to the governor to release long-serving people to commute sentences. You know, most of the 68 people who died have been incarcerated since the 70s and 80s. Most of them were elderly people. And so, you know, at what point do we say, okay, enough is enough? You know, at what point do we say, this is enough punishment? I don't believe people should be punished perpetually. What can we do now to, you know, to try to pressure for commutations, essentially, is what would save folks.
But Jacqueline, what about the prisoners that have pending exoneration cases? Is there any chance for them to be released on bond right now in the wake of COVID-19?
Certainly we would want that to happen, absolutely. And, you know, juvenile lifers as well, juvenile lifers who haven't been resentenced yet. William Garrison was a juvenile lifer who was, you know, a couple weeks away from walking out the door after 44 years in prison, sentenced at 16, and he passed away from COVID-19. And, you know, part of the reason, as Attorney Lamar was talking about, and you know, other folks, is that it takes a lot of money to have a legal team that can sort of rally around a bond appeal like that. And a lot of folks just don't have it. Also, you know, we would really sort of need a motion from the Supreme Court that they were going to take a case like that up and set a precedent for other folks to be released. And at this moment, they just, you know, they have considered bond cases, but they haven't taken any of those cases up to the Supreme Court yet.
That was the only reason. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that was the only reason I posed that question. You know, I work in politics all day, every day, and I know the power of advocacy and, you know, understanding that the governor is predisposed, obviously, you know, because a Democrat's predisposed toward these kind of issues in particular. I just wondered how strong the voices are of a constituency base that could get that moving, because you're right, there is power out of that office. And I just wondered how loud and consistent the voices are to accelerate some of this stuff.
I'd be happy to send petitions around and show you what we've been working on. There's a coalition of groups that are really pressing for it. You know, we've done sort of everything we can, and we have not gotten a lot of movement at all. I got to be honest, we just have not. And right, you know, I know there's a million things going on, but here we are sort of screaming into the void. It feels like the pen needs to be moving. We need to sort of sign these commutations and get folks out, just because we have no other release valve. We have no other way.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, to add on about the actual pandemic, where I was in prison, I didn't get released till April 21st. And actually, William Garrison was a good friend of mine. We was at Macomb Correctional Facility, and he was on his way home. To see him pass away from COVID, it was bone chilling. And the tone in there, it was almost comical what the MDLC was trying to do, or the lack thereof, for the prisoners. This was the time when there was a shortage on ventilators and respirators at the hospitals in the free world. So clearly, people that was prisoners already was not going to get those ventilators if it was up to someone in the free world or a prisoner getting it. It went to the people in the free world. So it was to the point where they was cutting up prisoner uniforms to make makeshift masks so prisoners can wear. The people that was affected in the prison was the prison guards. They spreaded it. No one in prison can take a flight or go to a restaurant to eat. So it had to come in from that way. The only way it could come in. They had stopped visits maybe 30 to 45 days before it started hitting in the prison system such as it did. It was very crazy, to say the least.
There was also a lot of incompetence surrounding it, just to back you up, Mr. Harrington. I mean, there was, you know, even at your facility, actually, there was 108 tests that were switched. I don't know if you heard about this, but then
Yeah, I was there.
54 people, were you there? 54 people were tested positive and put in the negative unit, and 54 people had tested negative and were put into the positive unit. I mean, that, you know, they were like, oh, sorry, we deleted a line on the Excel sheet, and that's why this happened. I mean, these are human beings' lives, and it was devastating to watch things like that happen. It was devastating to watch, you know, them turn off the fans, and now there are heat waves, and you know, just not be providing information. And as a matter of fact, it has gotten very, very stressful in a lot of these places. The Michigan Reformatory just had a very, very large fight that ended with 2 people being shot from the guard tower. There was almost, you know, an incident at Gus Harrison because so many people tested positive and they brought no medical practitioners to talk to folks. These are very tense standoffs that have a lot of potential to get very ugly very quick. We saw yesterday in Texas, a correctional officer was actually taken hostage due to one of these COVID-19 situations, and it was a tense standoff for hours and hours. It's just not sustainable to hold these many people inside, really ever, but especially now it's you know, showing us how unsustainable this pattern is. I've talked way over my 2 minutes. I'm sorry, I'll mute myself.
No, I was going to ask you a question too. What are some things that other states are doing to decrease their population in the prison setting? And can we pattern off of some of those other states and what they've been able to do?
We're really backing up against truth in sentencing here, which is really, really frustrating. Like California, for instance, just approved 8,000 people for early parole, right? Which puts a big dent. They have a much larger prison population, but it puts a big dent. But the fact that we have truth in sentencing, which we do believe that the governor has jurisdiction to suspend in the time of a national emergency. She just has not indicated that she was going to do that. You know, we're pressing up here against no commutations, you know, truth in sentencing. And the fact that we have really, really long minimums, you know, on average, a minimum in another state is about 2.3 years. In Michigan, it's about 4.5 years. So we are just like, you know, we're in this crisis of austerity that's pushing up against the crisis of the pandemic, and we don't have much besides really, really strong direct action from the governor. She could use this time in the state of emergency to make bold sort of sweeping moves to decarcerate, and she's not. And that's a problem because even though, you know, the first wave is kind of through and we don't have people dying every day, there are 10 facilities that don't have any positive cases yet, and most of them are up north where people are traveling all summer. So, you know, we're bracing here for the second wave without, you know, any movement from the governor's folks right now. And it's very frustrating.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question? Okay, my next question deals with accountability. So when you think about the wrongful convictions, when you think about the police killings, it often takes people speaking out or protesters you know, marching in the streets for anything to happen at all, anyone to be arrested or charged. And even then, it's often not guaranteed that there will be an indictment in that, or there will be a conviction. So I guess my question is, why is it so difficult to get accountability from government and law enforcement when there is police misconduct involved?
Well, I think it's a lack of accountability to have those type of powers that be step up. Again, we're talking about lower class people that's supposed to be cast away from the community that's going through these type of things, dealing with wrongful death suits, wrongful convictions. So if this part of the spectrum or this part of the aisle stands up, that means they have to go against some of their colleagues, some of the people they went to school with, some people that they know very well. They will have to step in the gap for somebody that they don't know at all. So I think that if we don't change the narrative of we are humans, it doesn't matter about my zip code or tax bracket, we continue to see this type of stuff going on.
Prosecutors and police have different immunities that are granted by law. And so when someone alleges that a prosecutor has mishandled their case, or they allege that a police officer has, you know, committed some type of police misconduct, there's immunities that keep these, that prevent the law enforcement and prosecutors from being held accountable. And so specifically with prosecutors, their immunity keeps them from being sued in civil suits. There are different cases that outline how prosecutors should handle cases with respect to evidence and with respect to governing police that are handling evidence. And it's unfortunate because even though these case laws tell prosecutors what they should and shouldn't do while handling a case, the cases don't have any teeth to them. There's no consequences. And so if you can prosecute even causing gross misconduct, like Mr. Harrington and Mr. Hines being incarcerated for years and years at a time and nothing happens, that's where the accountability falls short.
Anyone else?
I mean, I think so much of that has to do with what police will be held exactly as accountable as I think the community at large wants them to be. And for too long, the community at large just hasn't cared enough about that. You know, there have been times when we come across a case that features a lot of police misconduct. And sometimes, Kevin's case is one, it even comes out at trial. And the jury knows about it and they still choose to convict. And that's because they as a community have made a decision that there are certain people they are going to trust and put the power in the hands of, and other people that they're going to really stack the deck against. And I would hope, you know, from kind of the current discussions we're having in this country today, that this will begin to change. It seems there is a push to at least curtail the immunity that police officers have. And I think from what we've seen, not only recently, but really throughout history of policing in America, there may be an argument for immunity, but it's been much, much overplayed over the years. There are police officers who know full well that the worst thing that will happen to them for misconduct is that, you know, they might get demoted at best. Whereas an individual in, you know, kind of the regular community, if they commit any of those actions, they're looking at, you know, huge prison time. And I think that's starting to change a little bit. I think you have juries that are a little bit more skeptical of police officer testimony than they used to be 5, 10, 15 years ago. But I think it's just, we as a community decide what our police officers and prosecutors prioritize. We do it largely indirectly, of course, but if that becomes something that we care more about, that we want to curtail police officers abusing their power, then that sort of thing over a period of years will stop happening. It's just, does the community have enough of a desire to make those changes? And I'm hopeful today that we're moving further in that direction.
Good. Anyone else want to chime in?
Just recently, you know, I want to give kudos. I think Lisa's being too humble, but you know, with the NAACP in particular, and we had a situation here just recently where, you know, a police officer used excessive force. You know, sustained voices. And I think, unfortunately, I think both our attorneys said it, you know, we have these outrages and it's almost like people just wait for you to go away. And more often than not, in most cases, that's exactly what happens. People just go away. But I think sustained voices, and not an outrage, but a constant pounding on the door about seeking justice and holding police officers accountable. More importantly, their bosses, their city managers, the city council. It's deeper than just the cop themselves. You know, look, they sign the back of a check. And every time they get a check, they sign the back of it. They aren't able to go out and do whatever it is they want to do. Just like the officer did in Minneapolis, who 17 times after having been, you know, served up with a warning, wasn't able to go back out. It was inevitable that he was going to kill somebody or hurt somebody because 17 times somebody said it was okay. So I think the fact that the NAACP here locally didn't go away and made sure that there was an accountability, it happened. You know, so we had a police officer here who was fired, and so he doesn't get 16 more times to do something wrong. And I think that zero tolerance piece, it sends a very clear message to both the police chief, his boss, the city council, all those people pop up, that somebody's going to come knock on your door when somebody does something wrong, and they're not going to go away.
Anyone else?
Well, I was going to say thank you for mentioning that, and because it's very important to hold people accountable for their actions, and I know a big part of that is funding. And when you have those immunities that are put in place that don't impact someone's funding or organization's funding, in order to make systemic change in those areas, we have to make sure that funding is attached to some of those things, because money talks loud and clear. And being able to be a part of those discussions, being able to be a part of that accountability group or organization makes people more aware and accountable for their actions. And I think that now that they see that we are looking, that people are looking, and some of these things are not going to be swept on the rug as they have been and so many other times before. So thanks for bringing that up, Mr. Green. Appreciate that.
Thank you. On the topic of wrongful convictions, can you guys maybe discuss what type of evidence it takes to actually exonerate someone?
Sure, I could start that if you like. And I'm happy to report that it's starting to change a little bit. When the Innocence Clinic at the University of Michigan was founded in 2009, it almost always took DNA evidence to clear somebody of a crime. Not always. There were non-DNA exonerations, and some attorneys in Michigan and nationally worked very hard.
I'm not sure if we lost him or maybe.
Or maybe Janae can click back in. That's your wheelhouse too.
Yeah, can you maybe discuss that, Janae, while we come back?
So with the wrongful convictions and the evidence that's required, you've got a number of what's called post-conviction remedies available to those that are seeking to have their conviction overturned. And so they all have their various hurdles, which requires the person seeking to be freed to present some type of evidence, credible. I know for 6.500 motions, you have to present evidence that the court would consider material. You have to, there's just a number of hurdles. And for instance, a person that was wrongfully convicted, if all they have is maybe an affidavit saying that, from a person saying that they didn't commit the crime, that's probably not going to be enough. Even though it's very true that the person didn't commit the crime, the way that the procedure is set up, it's to, one, prevent the court's time and resources from being wasted, which is certainly unfair when you're talking about someone trying to get out of prison and come from behind a wrongful conviction. But there's just a number of evidentiary hurdles that that the wrongfully convicted have to overcome. And if you can't overcome those hurdles, you could very well spend the rest of your life in prison. And that's the most unfortunate thing ever. And I think that what Professor was speaking to was the fact that they are starting to, I guess, kind of relax the standards and the requirements that are needed to possibly be have the conviction overturned, if you will.
I would like to add in on that.
Go ahead.
I believe a lot of things definitely has changed. I'm a living example of that. I think that they're just looking at the filings more in depth. I was the only person in the state of Michigan to undergo 4 consecutive trials for the same murder. That's unheard of. How did this happen? I think they're putting more gatekeepers to see like something is going wrong with this case. In regards to getting your case overturned, you must have something called newly discovered evidence. Newly discovered meaning the court never seen this before. It hasn't been testified to. And even sometimes when you get that right, such as in my case, the courts will still deny you. I was denied numerous times in the course of many years until the CIU stepped in conjunction with the University of Michigan Innocence Clinic. But after that, I could have clearly died in prison for a case that clearly I didn't do or had anything to do with.
And Mr. Harrington, so what you're saying is that if the conviction integrity unit hadn't been created, you might still be in prison.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It looks like Professor Syed rejoined us. Did you want to finish your answer, Professor?
I lost power and then it came back, so that's good. I'm sorry I missed the answers, of course. I didn't catch what other people said. But yeah, all I was going to say, I think Kevin was getting into that, which is the standards have always been very difficult for trying to show that you didn't do something once you've been convicted. What really helped us out in Kevin's case, and that was after 11 years of working on it, is today, at least in Wayne County, this has become the business of not just defense attorneys like myself and not just exonerees and their families. This has become, thankfully, the business of the prosecutor's office as well, to try to take a look at what's gone wrong. And I fully agree that if there had been no conviction integrity unit, Kevin would still be in prison. And while we have some great attorneys and students at my office, I'm not sure he would ever have gotten out if it wasn't for the conviction integrity unit. Maybe that's the first time I've said that in Kevin's presence. We were going to fight, but it was going to be difficult. And that's something that really is a no-brainer that needs to exist other places. I'm very happy that Wayne County and Detroit has started to make that easier, to have new evidence heard and to have it evaluated properly. Because the reason Kevin and others keep losing in courts is because courts have a different view on what they're supposed to do with appeals. Courts don't look at substantive evidence on an appeal. If you walk in and say, I'm innocent, the court will say, that's fine, but what's your legal claim? And that's the hardest part, that legal standards can get stacked up against people, whether they're innocent or, even if they're not innocent, but have meaningful evidence that shows they were overcharged, overconvicted, and oversentenced. My hope is that's starting to get easier, but there's a long way to go in Michigan alone, let alone other places. There's a lot of counties where there's been massive misconduct and essentially framing people that are still in denial about it. And, I hope that Wayne County is an example that people will learn from. But today, it still remains incredibly difficult to exonerate yourself, regardless of what your evidence might be. So hopefully that's starting to change, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Professor. We're going to move on to part 2 of our discussion. In this part, I want to hear more about Robert Hines' case from Attorney Lamar. I want to hear more from Mr. Kevin Harrington about his case. And another case that we haven't talked about is one of Alfonso Clark that Mr. Harrington should be able to talk about. So first question goes to you, Janine. Tell us what was the prosecution's theory in Mr. Hines' case. And can we get the evidence exhibit also pulled up on the screen while she's speaking?
Okay, so Nikhil, the theory more so speaks to just the verbal explanation. The exhibits, we'll kind of get into those a little later. The prosecution's theory is that at opening at trial, that Robert was connected to a group of rappers that recorded at the victim's studio. And the name of the group is Silent Assassins, and they had a record label called Red Rum, which spells murder backwards. Robert was allegedly friends with this group of rappers. And so when the prosecution gets to closing argument, the prosecutor says that the victim was killed because he began a business, which was the recording studio that somebody wanted. The prosecutor further states that the victim's killing wasn't a random act of robbery and that Robert executed the victim for no reason. She then concludes that Robert killed the victim because he wanted to be a hitman and a part of this rap group.
So there were some documents that supported Mr. Hines' claims that he was innocent, that he discovered. Can you talk about those documents and what was in those?
Yes, if the exhibits are going to be posted, I can kind of go through those.
Yeah, we're still waiting for those to come up on the screen.
Okay, no worries.
Wait a minute. Here we go. Okay.
Well, that's the CIU application.
Okay. So,
Okay, I see the list of documents on the right-hand side of the screen. So there were fingerprints found on the vehicle that was at the scene of the crime, and they were usable fingerprints, but those fingerprints were not disclosed to Mr. Hines' trial attorney. And so the fact that he didn't know that these usable fingerprints that did not belong to him were found at the scene, that deprived him of the right to fair trial and strengthening his defense. There was also a hair follicle with a root attached found in the car. I think it was on one of the bandanas. And so that hair follicle, one, his trial attorney didn't know that it existed. Two, his trial attorney didn't know if there were any results, if the hair follicle had ever been tested. Yet another deprivation of a fair trial. There was, let's see. You guys go back to the other screen. So there were police reports that indicated that home invasions occurred at the victim's residence. And the home invasion report showed that that the murder could have very well been an actual random robbery because someone had robbed the victim before. There was a tip sheet indicating that another man named Earl was possibly a suspect. And all of this evidence that was found in the miscellaneous file, those were things that could have been used to actually prove Robert's innocence. And it's called exculpatory evidence, evidence that exonerates a person from the crime that they've been accused of.
so the prosecutor from the case, was it Christine Cowell? Is that who it was?
Christine Cowell, she is yet a prosecutor in Wayne County.
Okay, so it seems that it would be her responsibility for knowing about all of the evidence and disclosing it, that it was in the possession of the Detroit Police Department. Why was this evidence not presented earlier on?
That's exactly right. I don't know why it wasn't presented, but it was absolutely her burden to know of all evidence in Detroit Police Department's possession, as well as any evidence that she had on her own. And the line of cases, Brady v. Maryland, and those that follow provide unequivocally that Wayne County Prosecutor Christine Cowell had a duty to disclose all of that evidence. The only thing that I could think of was not wanting to undermine the defense. I'm sorry, the prosecution.
So is there any accountability here? I mean, it seems like another issue right there is holding prosecutors accountable for not doing their jobs. I mean.
And I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, and that's the issue with the Brady line of cases, is it says what a prosecutor should do, or I'm sorry, what a prosecutor is supposed to do. But because of immunity, there's no real consequence to it. There are Michigan professional rules of conduct, which govern all attorneys. There's even a special section that governs what prosecutors are supposed to do. And all attorneys, including myself, if we see misconduct playing out at trial, if we see misconduct playing out anywhere, when it comes to attorneys, we have a duty to report it. But unfortunately, attorneys don't report things that they see because they don't want to be, I guess, deemed a snitch. But it's right there in the rules of professional conduct. You can be disciplined by the State Bar of Michigan for violating the rules of ethics. But at this point, because a prosecutor doesn't suffer any real consequence for discharging their duties as a prosecutor, we're just not seeing that, unfortunately. And until, like Black Lives Matter, until we cry out about police killings and about wrongful prosecutions and imprisonment, I think that it's kind of going to continue. And I think that it does require some rogue attorneys, if you will, to step up and say, hey, this is wrong, this is not right. And until those things begin to happen, I think, unfortunately, that it may continue.
So where does Mr. Hines' case stand now?
Currently, there has not been an update on his case since about late March. It's my understanding that there's been no work done on the case, unfortunately. And so, with the Conviction Integrity Unit, the transparency regarding the steps that they take and the time frame for, I guess, making a decision about whether or not the conviction is wrongful isn't really known to the public. And so at this time, I don't really know what's happening with Robert's case. I would expect to receive some written correspondence regarding, what steps will happen next.
Okay. Anyone have any thoughts on this case, or anything want to chime in on Mr. Hines' case at all? No? Okay. Mr. Harrington,
Yes.
you were exonerated after your legal team was able to prove that there was police misconduct involved in your case by Inkster Police Detective Anthony Del Greco, where he threatened witnesses. Can you talk a little bit more about your wrongful conviction and your feelings about it?
Anthony Abdullah.
Who was it?
Abdullah.
Okay.
Well, my feelings was, I was excited, ecstatic. I'm still floating on cloud nine as we speak. To overcome such a journey as that, we don't see this happening every day, such as she was just speaking about Mr. Hines' case. This is a fight. You are in a fight, and you must tap into your faith outside of just your fight. So as I was speaking earlier, I was saying that I underwent 4 consecutive trials. This is unheard of. How can someone go through 4 trials for the exact same case? The thing is, they wanted me to plead out. They asked me 4 years. They said, you do 4 years, we'll let you go home. But I would never agree to something I did not do. So I stood, and I was found guilty again. And they sentenced me natural life without the possibility of parole. So in the course of that journey, the University of Michigan stepped in. Actually, Imran, who's on the panel right now, he was the student attorney that had my case. And now he's the professor there. So as they worked diligently on my case, the CIU stepped in, and they started really taking a hard look of everything that we've been following and getting denied on. So they coerced the witness, they threatened the witness, they hid evidence, even to the point we just found evidence right before I came home. 17 years later, it was still evidence hid in the locker of the police department. This is crazy. And so I'm here now, and I advocate for those that still wrongly convicted, and people that don't understand the law, that come from urban areas in which I come from, through my consulting firm, Justice Group Consulting.
The detective on your case was the same detective from Alfonso Clark's case. Alfonso Clark was a 38-year-old Michigan man convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison in 2005. Mr. Clark has actually filed an exoneration application with the Wayne County Conviction Integrity Unit, where he alleges that the detective threatened to lock witnesses up if they told the truth. Kevin, do you believe that every case that this detective was a part of during his career should be reviewed for police misconduct?
Absolutely. If we're going to be real and transparency, we must look into this, because this is not a situation where you can say, oops, I made a mistake. This is not like spilling a cup of coffee on the floor. You have to be some type of sick, twisted individual to go into a community and snatch young men, young women up and sentence them to death. You're giving them a death sentence for something they didn't do. So every case that he's involved in needs to be opened up. Actually, I spoke to Valerie Newman this morning, and we discussed a few issues in which she's investigating on the behalf of Alfonso Clark, one of my clients. I have great confidence in the CIU. Like the professor was speaking, it's a great chance that I wouldn't even be here today without their help. That's my thoughts on that.
Another question about Mr. Clark's case. I guess what factors made it possible for him to be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no evidence actually tying him to the homicide?
To just be candid about it, being that I went through 4 trials, just having a different type of skin tone with a wrong jury pool, you can be convicted. It doesn't take much. If you're sitting next to your lawyer and at the defense table and the prosecution is on the other aisle, for some reason, the jury will convict. I say that from the standpoint of me having no evidence. Alfonso Clark being in the same position, his case almost mirrors my case. He has numerous affidavits where witnesses say they witnessed someone that was 6'3" or 6'2", in a total different body build than Alfonso Clark. And he still was convicted, and he still continues to get denied on appeal. But the silver lining is the CIU has the case, and she reaffirmed that she's working diligent, to get a great result, and I'm confident in that.
Do you have the photos of Mr. Clark?
I don't have photos, but what I do have is some of the affidavits. I do have some of the trial transcripts, some of the private investigator work. I have those different things.
Okay. So where does that case stand? Like what's next?
Well, so you have an option. When the conviction integrity unit steps in, you can continue to file and they won't investigate. You can't do both. Or you can agree and say, hey, you guys can investigate my case. And once they find out all the things in which they do in your case, they can decide whether, hey, you are wrongly convicted, or we don't see enough evidence and you continue filing on your appeal. We have great hopes that with Alfonso Clark, they will see everything that we're arguing, that he's an actual innocent person serving a natural life sentence for something he did not do.
Did anyone have any thoughts on Mr. Harrington's case or Mr. Clark's case at all?
I'll comment just a little bit. I think obviously Mr. Harrington's case is incredibly sad when you consider a young man who's in college getting pulled into this, losing 17 years of his life. To me, the strangest and saddest part was always how hard the prosecutor's office tried to convict him and his co-defendant when there was virtually no evidence against them, how much they tried to protect the police misconduct in this case. As Kevin said, he went to 4 trials before he was finally convicted. That's an immense amount of resources that the prosecutor's office put in to backing up a lie. But I think the kind of really positive thing to look at this is, despite all of that, their own prosecutor, conviction integrity unit is why Kevin is now released. So I hope that regardless of how hard they had fought to make this conviction, and I for that reason, I would have thought this would be one of the toughest cases to get the CIU to overturn, because their office had fought so hard to convict him. But I walked away with a real positive feeling that they are willing to, do the right thing, even in cases where they have so much invested in having convicted the wrong person. So I hope that'll happen in Mr. Clark's case and other cases as well.
I'm gonna sort of redirect things and ask a few questions that anyone on the panel can answer. The state of Michigan ranks 5th in the nation for wrongful convictions. And when you think about the cases of Mr. Hines, Mr. Clark, Mr. Harrington, I mean, what is the major reason behind this? What is Michigan doing wrong?
Well, I think Michigan is doing a great, in the past, definitely doing a lot of things wrong. It's like when you're charged with something, and I came out of Wayne County, it seemed like you didn't have a voice. It seemed like I could scream to the top of my lungs that I was innocent, I didn't do this. And even if you had great attorneys, it seemed like they'll muscle them out. I had an attorney by the name of Marlon Evans. He was even locked up in contempt before, and this was like kind of unusual. It happens, but it was just so many bizarre different things that was going on, and it seemed like the whole trained was to just lock these people up from this particular area. You had people coming in that didn't look like me and had a different zip code and might have more financial stability than I had and was getting better results. So when you're talking about an impoverished area, and you don't have that many resources, they just allow those things to happen. But I think it's a new day. I think they're turning a new leaf, and they're trying very hard. And they have some gatekeepers that's ahead of things down there now, and they're trying to turn things around.
I think so much of this has to do with how Michigan especially had unchecked police misconduct. For so long, the Detroit Police Department was doing things, and that's just an example, other departments were as well. The federal government came in with a consent decree, I wanna say around 2000 or early 2000s, because there was this pattern of violating the constitutional rights of defendants and even witnesses in cases. So I think that had a lot to do with it. And the other was that for years, and this is starting to change in just the past couple of years, Michigan devoted less resources to public defense than virtually any other state in the country. We're very close to the bottom of that list. And I think that's why. If you have a properly supported lawyer who has enough resources and time to do what they need to do about your case, then a lot of these other things can get ferreted out at the beginning. You know, witnesses that are lying can be challenged appropriately. Evidence that needs to be tested by a forensic lab can be done. However, if you really don't have an attorney who has the time and resources to do what they need to do at the front end, you're gonna have a lot of people getting convicted for things they didn't do, or getting, you know, essentially over convicted and over sentenced. And so I think that those two things were the biggest reason why Michigan ranks so high on that list of wrongful convictions.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Gotta put the spotlight back on the prosecution. Prosecutors are supposed to pursue justice, and justice doesn't always mean a conviction. Prosecutors have a lot of discretion. They have a lot of power. The prosecutor basically says, okay, you're going to be charged with this, this, and this. And they have the ability to dismiss the charge if it's in the interest of justice. And so as attorneys, highly educated, having specific training relevant to the law, you can charge someone and begin, I guess, building the case. But if there's a point where you see, these witnesses don't really seem credible, the victim, there's some holes in that story. Ultimately, the prosecution can see before they go to trial that there are issues and that the case probably shouldn't be tried, but yet they proceed with it anyway. And kind of just going back to Robert's case, Robert had a number of witnesses that had motive to lie, a number of witnesses that arguably were coerced by police while they were being questioned and given statements. And so when those things begin to happen and you as a prosecutor in such a high office ignore those things, that's where the problems arise. And like I said, if a prosecutor can look at a case and say, we'll dismiss this in the interest of justice, I think that's far better than building a case with people who are probably not being truthful, with evidence being hidden, ultimately depriving people of their livelihoods.
Let's try and have the DNA results in Mr. Hines' case for misrepresentation.
Say it one more time.
Talk about the DNA results in Mr. Hines' case, like how they were misrepresented.
Certainly. So here it is on the screen. So at trial, what the judge clarified in Robert's case was that not only could Robert not be excluded from the DNA, but anyone else in the room couldn't be excluded from the DNA. So I couldn't be excluded from the DNA. All of the panelists couldn't be excluded from the DNA. And the issue with that is after trial, when Robert went to appeal, when he went before the Court of Appeals, his appellate attorney incorrectly included in the statement of facts that Robert was not excluded from the DNA, which misled the Court of Appeals to write in their opinion that he wasn't excluded, ultimately basically killing his chance at getting a new trial and having any justice done at the appellate level. And so I'm not a DNA expert. It takes the science behind all of that to speak a little more exclusively to the DNA, but ultimately the DNA results did not conclude that the DNA belonged to Robert.
So we're going to start wrapping up here, but I do have one last question that I would like each of you to answer within 1 minute. What can we do as a community to make sure that our children don't become another statistic for wrongfully incarcerated Black people in America?
Well, I guess I'll go first then. Keeping it under a minute, I think so much of this is driven by, and I think we've heard it repeatedly, are the accountabilities. I would love to see, it's so sad because I hear all these different things every day, it seems like, and the more I hear them, the less I see change. I mean, real change. And I don't suspect that moving forward, and I notice on our agenda we have a call to action, but I don't see how we could be optimistic about anything changing unless we make dramatic changes. We talk about the prosecutors in particular. That's an elected position. We talk about, and I hate the fact that it's so political, but I would just love to see us as a community use more accountability to those people who are hiring people, who are charged with enforcing people. I think we can change the world if we just house it down to our own zip codes. I think the rest of the world is so big that it's daunting and we go back to our day-to-days. I like to just see us as, and my call to action is to pay attention to my zip code, what's happening in my zip code. Because one of the things I know about success is that it bleeds out when you do it right. And so that's just my call to action, is to take care of my own backyard, look at my own zip code and make sure that I can protect my children by being more proactive in these kind of initiatives and not on panels talking about reactive actions of them.
We just lost two big icons in the civil rights movement. Yeah. And I think that in order to make those changes, we need to vote. Voting is a major issue. Voting not only in our presidential elections, but we have state and local elections, and holding those people accountable for their actions. And if they're not doing what we think they should be doing, they can be voted out. To volunteer to serve on boards. There are a number of boards that are open in our cities, in our townships, in our counties, to be a part of those decisions on those boards, to be at that table when these rules and policies and regulations are written, to be a part of that discussion and to be a part of those changes. And also to look at joining organizations that promote your same thoughts and your same ideology. There's power in numbers. One person can't do it alone, but there's power in numbers. And also to be able to teach others so that we can pass the torch on to our millennials, to our other generations that are coming up behind us, because this is going to be a long process. And some of us have been in the fight for a while, but to be able to mentor those other ones that are coming up, that they can pick up that torch and continue to run with it, as we're going to have to do with our civil rights organizations and people that have passed on before us.
I think if I'll go next, I certainly echo all of that. And unfortunately, this comes down to, those who've been affected by what's gone wrong are the ones who are in the best position to tell people about it and to bring about that change. Now, this is unfair, clearly, because if a person has been targeted by police misconduct, wrongfully convicted, like Mr. Harrington, for example, I mean, his story is powerful, and there's stuff he can do and stuff that I can do, and kind of telling that story to inspire people to pay more attention to, as was said, not only who's running for, president, but also who's running for their state legislature, who's running for judges. I mean, we have elected judges in this state, and that makes a huge difference. And who's running for prosecutor. And, not only voting, but also ensuring that the people who, regardless of who wins, they understand that their constituency demands certain actions. You know, why we have these difficult sentencing standards and very tough standards for, you know, criminal defense, and why we have over-incarceration. All of this happened because politicians believed their constituencies wanted certain things. And maybe they did, you know, back when those laws were passed. But those things can be changed, and they can be changed by, you know, everyone kind of doing their part, and everyone brings something different to the table. This doesn't mean, you know, everyone can run for prosecutor or everyone can run for the state legislature. But, you know, just about everyone can run for the state legislature, come to think of it. But at least, you know, voting for the right people and holding them accountable once they're in office, which is, as we've seen in recent months, it's not impossible to do. We have a lot of lawmakers and a lot of politicians and judges who are suddenly saying different things than they were a couple of years ago about the exact same issues. And that's because the community's made itself more heard. And, you know, that's kind of a really broad thing. No one person is enough to make that movement, but we are all, you know, members of important communities and constituencies, and using that power, I think, is the best answer.
Jacqueline, do you want to weigh in, or?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with what everyone said, and I especially think local politics are very important, having your voice heard, joining boards. But I think that we really need to listen to and try to find space for like the radical reimagining of what we're doing here with the criminal justice system, what we're doing here with prisons specifically. If prison was effective at, you know, tearing down social harms, we would be the safest country in the entire world, right? There would be no crime because we incarcerate so very many people, more than all the other NATO countries, you know, essentially combined. There's just thousands, millions of us incarcerated. So, you know, when we're thinking about what we need to do, we really should engage with some of, you know, the Miriam Cabos of the world, the Angela Davis, the Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who talk about, you know, exactly what Mr. Green was saying, like really focusing on community, and Ms. Coney as well, but also like having this broad picture of what we really want out of our criminal justice system. And just to, you know, pull in something quickly that Miriam Caba says, when she looks at, you know, when someone has been harmed, or there's been a crime committed, or there's been something done that is detrimental to the community, they start by asking 3 questions, right? Who has been harmed? What that person needs to, that person or family or relationship or whatever needs to restore that harm or transform themselves to feel better, and whose job is it to do that? And if we can really integrate those things into a system that atones for harm, because not all crimes are harms and not all harms are crimes, right? But if we can really integrate ourselves into a system that thinks about restoration and transformation of our communities and caring for one another and developing relationships and developing empathy, we're going to have a much better time than relying on a system that perpetually punishes some of the most harmed in our communities. There's not a victim and criminal dichotomy here. Some of the most harmed people are the people who do the harms. And so we really need to start looking at the root causes of these things and reimagine for ourselves what we can be doing here.
Kevin is telling me that he got knocked out and someone needs to let him back in if that's possible. Could someone do that?
Okay. Janae, either of you want to weigh in while we're waiting on him?
Certainly. Ultimately, a community absolutely has to come together, and the outcry has to be just as loud as the outcry is for police violence and police misconduct. Every injustice that impacts people should be given an equal outcry, if you will. And, you know, not just crying out, not just getting on social media pissed off, but actually attacking it on a political level, attacking it systematically, just as racism, you know, just as racism systematically impacts people, we've got to hit back with systematic solution. And so ultimately, community politics, holding people to what they say they'll do when they get into office, actually putting the time and resources into dismantling these systems that impact people like Robert Hines, people like Kevin Harrington, people who are innocent. Robert is innocent. And so that these things don't continue to happen, we've got to get on the ground. We've got to be loud. We've got to be disruptive. We've got to be unruly. And I think that that's a good starting point for us to not see another Robert Hines or another Kevin Harrington.
Lisa? Lisa, did you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, I thought I did. I was just talking about the voting and making sure that we are electing those people in those different positions that that speak for us. And if they don't, time to vote them out. And being a part of our community, a part of those boards, a part of those organizations, and just remember, to mentor others so that this work can continue, so that we can be able to pass that torch on to our next generation of leaders.
Absolutely.
Kevin's back. It looks like Kevin.
Yeah, it's guys.
Did you have any lasting thoughts at all?
Yes. I just want to say I thank you guys for even allowing me on this panel. You guys know my journey, and I haven't even been home 90 days. I think that what we're doing is awesome because we must start with a conversation, and then we must put it in action, though. I don't want to just talk, and we do nothing.
I agree.
So we must educate each other. We must bring someone else up. We must stand together for those that want to fight. And for those who don't, they must have a seat. And that's within public office. That's with the judges. That's with the officers. I'm not against officers or policing. I'm against misconduct. I'm against those officers that want to pillage from the community. I understand they have a job to do, and we must stand together. And for those that don't, they must get another job, be a good shoe salesman or something. But they can't police a community to where you can snatch someone out their house and say, we're going to send you to death. You're not the judge, you're not the jury. That should never happen again. And we should all be very afraid that this is taking place right now. We must get the brother Hines out. We must, Fonzo Clark, look into these cases and get these guys that's wrongly convicted out. The evidence is right there. You don't have to believe what I'm saying or any lawyer saying. The evidence is there and it's going to lead to justice. Thank you for having me.
That's beautiful.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you so much for being brave enough to come out and share your story. Your voice is needed, for sure.
Thank you.
Can someone pull up our call to action slides? We'd like to let our audiences watching know how they can get involved and what they can do to help these efforts from a Life to a Life Urban Initiative. You can sign the petition for Robert Hines exoneration. The website link is right there at change.org/freeRobertHines. If you would like to join the advocacy team for Robert Hines or be a part of the work that A Life for a Life is doing, email rtsecondchance@gmail.com. You can make a donation to Robert Hines Legal Fund through GoFundMe, Free Robert Hines, or you can Cash App $RT Second Chance. No donation is too small. So that concludes our panel for today. One message that I've been asked to relay is that A Life for a Life encourages families of wrongfully convicted loved ones to look for a local conviction integrity unit or innocence clinics in their community and to never stop fighting. The third and final town hall is scheduled for Sunday, August 16th at 4 p.m. Under the title, The Families Tell All. So thank you all for watching today. I hope that everyone took something away from this And thank you to all of our panelists for making time for this very important conversation. And thank you for the work that you're doing, whether in the legal field or the advocacy field, to hope to bring some equality into this country's criminal justice system. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Have a
God
great.
bless.
God bless you guys.
God bless.